In the late 18th century, England was embroiled in a raging debate over the slave trade. William Wilberforce had worked for decades to change the hearts and the minds of the English people and the English government. Finally, on February 23, 1807, the House of Commons voted by overwhelming majority to abolish the slave trade. It was into this context that the son of a doctor was born. His name was Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin grew up as an ardent abolitionist. He hated slavery. And so for him, in his mind, evolution was one of the ways that he could try to persuade people that slavery was actually a moral wrong and morally evil. Because if all human beings were related to each other, then there was no difference between the African and the Western white man. All human beings descended from a common ancestor, and so therefore all human beings are related and should be treated equally and fairly and justly. And so this idea of evolution, Darwin learned from his father, Erasmus Darwin, who worked on the theory of evolution for years, and Darwin was also exposed to it during his studies at the University of Edinburgh. Some of the greatest scientific minds of the time helped educate Darwin and bring him up to speed on the latest thought and science behind the theory of evolution. So for Darwin, he was adamant at finding justification for the abolition of the slave trade, and evolution was a huge part for Darwin in doing that. And of course, the slave trade and all of slavery was abolished. Eventually, slave trade was abolished in 1807, and then the slavery in general was abolished in England in 1833. Wouldn't come until much later in the United States after the Civil War in the late 19th century. So, how did this idea this idea of common descent or natural selection, all that, come about for Darwin? What's the story there? So, for Darwin, he was still thinking as an abolitionist. For him, he wanted to work on the theory of common descent, so that if he felt like if he could establish common descent and common ancestry, then he would have the perfect basis for justifying the abolition of slavery and also for helping to eradicate racism in society, which is a bit ironic considering that one of the charges against evolution today is that it's inherently racist. I think Darwin would have thought modern day, the people who make this argument would think that they're crazy, given the fact that his whole purpose in building the theory of evolution by common descent and through natural selection was to help eradicate racism in the world. So the first turning point in Darwin's life came, of course, on his infamous voyage on the HMS Beagle. This was a 5-year journey on board the ship, and he was to play the role of naturalist. And so his job was to collect specimens, do geological surveys, uncover geological record and fossils, all kinds of cool stuff like that. And it was, of course, during one of these trips to the Galapagos Islands that Darwin discovered the varying beak sizes in the bird known as the Galapagos Finch. And so for Darwin, this was the first real hard evidence he had that nature selects certain advantages in populations of species. That if you have a beak that's more fit for eating certain types of seeds or certain types of fruit, nature naturally selects those advantages and passes them on to the organisms in the population. So this was a huge discovery for Darwin. The next turning point in Darwin's life came when his father and his daughter died. These two people meant the most to Darwin. And he was crushed, absolutely crushed, when they both passed away. It was a result of their passing that Darwin began to question the doctrine of hell, and he began to think about the afterlife. And he struggled immensely with the idea that people could go to hell and that God would send people to hell for all of eternity. And so this kind of, it really had a big impact on Darwin. It eventually kind of drove him to the brink of agnosticism. And he talks about God in his early editions of On the Origin of Species. But scholars debate whether or not that was just more out of contextual pressure or whether Darwin actually believed that God had a hand. And there's still some debate about that. But at least in the early editions of On the Origin of Species, Darwin does still reference God, and that God does have, the divine has a role to play in evolution by natural selection. Whether or not he still believed that near the end of his life, scholars still debate that, though it would seem that Darwin was not antagonistic toward God. He certainly was an atheist or antagonistic against theists. He wasn't an atheist, and he wasn't combative toward theists, but rather he sort of just kind of focused on the natural mechanisms by which things happened in the world. And so those were kind of the big impacts that affected Darwin's. And Darwin's theory made a lot of theologians very uneasy, but as we've seen, this was very healthy for the church and for theologians, because now that there was a natural mechanism to explain how organisms changed, how populations change, how species change over time, it raised some important questions for theologians to have to address. And fortunately, they did address those questions, and the debate is still raging today. But for Darwin, it's easy to want to kind of cast him in one of two roles. We either want to place him on a pedestal in almost a sort of a deified position as the great man who set free the minds of religious people in a religious context to think freely and to throw off the shackles of religion and the church and to think as a scientist. There's the temptation to cast him as that. And then there's the other temptation to cast him as basically the devil incarnate, the man who came to destroy the church, destroy religion, destroy people's faith in God, and to explain everything through natural means. And he was a materialist and a philosophical naturalist. These are kind of the two extremes, but still primarily the two prominent views by which Darwin is cast in modern terms. And when we actually sit down and look at the history behind Darwin, what we find is that's not true at all. Neither of those are really true. Darwin was just a real good naturalist, a good scientist, who was deeply affected by certain tragedies in his life that caused him to question certain things, just like anyone else would be questioning and the goodness of God and the doctrine of hell during these traumatic events. Very normal thing to have happen. But the important thing to remember is the things that were driving Darwin to, for example, the events of his father's passing and his daughter passing. These happened well after he was working on his theory of evolution by natural selection. These were not events that drove him to work on the theory of natural selection. These were events that were happening simultaneously as that work was already going on. Initially, what was driving Darwin's work was a love for humanity, was a desire to abolish slavery, to establish justice and equality in society. These are all good things that the church and Christianity would applaud as motivations for work. And they're things that we should applaud today as motivations for scientific work as well. And so Darwin wasn't some hero that we look up to who wanted to smash the authoritarian church and bring down Christianity and destroy people's faith. It's not who he was. And he's not to be deified in that way, and he's not to be vilified in that way. That just wasn't a motivation of his. His motivation was to bring equality and justice to the world. And that is a wonderful motivation. So regardless of what you think about Darwin, historically speaking, Darwin was a good man who was doing good work and helped change the world by putting forth a scientific theory that explains the natural mechanisms by which we as Christians would say God works in the world. And so I think there's much to thank Darwin for in his contributions to the world. And there's much to take caution for when we're reading about the theory of evolution and saying, hey, this isn't an inherently atheistic theory, and it's something that we can study with joy and with excitement about where these discoveries can lead. So thanks so much for tuning in. That's our podcast for this week. We appreciate you being here. If you have a question or a comment or suggestion, you can leave it in the comment section below or email us. Our email address is scienceandfaithdortmund@gmail.com. Also check out our website. We have lots of articles up there and resources for you to check out as well. Our website address is scienceandfaith.de. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time here on the Science and Faith Podcast.